Good morning, folks. This is Instructor Dana. We are continuing our discussion on Immanuel Kant's ethics. We're going to pick up where we left off last time. We didn't quite get a chance to talk about those two central issues from that first of the chapters. Discussion of what are called hypothetical imperatives and Kant's categorical imperative. Now, folks, Immanuel Kant frames moral rules as imperatives. And when he uses the word imperative, he means the very same thing that an imperative statement means in grammar. If somebody makes an imperative statement, it's a what? Starts with a C. It's a command. Do this, don't do this. That is an imperative. Stop texting on your phone while you're driving. Stop being on your cell phone when you're in class. Things of that nature. Those are imperative statements. Morality consists of imperatives. Now, the text first talks about what he calls hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives will apply to specific scenarios. The reason why they're called hypotheticals is because they are actual hypotheses for directing us in particular situations. Now, one ought not to tell lies would be a case of a Kantian hypothetical imperative. One ought not to treat individuals badly. One ought not to treat this individual as, in other words, hypothetical imperatives will apply to concrete, actual circumstances. That's why we call them hypotheticals. Now, folks, Kant's main moral principle, it's called the categorical imperative. Now, folks, if a statement is categorically true, it implies that it is both general and universal. If a statement is said to be categorical, it implies that it is both a general as well as a universal statement. Now, folks, the categorical imperative is stated this way in most English translations of the German. And I'm going to say it slowly because it's a little bit wordy. Act such that the maximum of your conduct could be willed to be a universal law of nature. Always act such that the maximum of your conduct could be willed to be a universal law of nature. Now, I already talked about the way that Kant uses the word maxim. A maxim is not just a saying. That's the way a lot of people think of maxims in everyday conversation. A maxim in Kant's sense, is a rule that rational agents give to themselves. In other words, you have to recognize it as true, and you also implicitly have to freely consent to it. In other words, if you're doing it under threats, it's not really you choosing to take those actions. Now, when I talk about this idea of willing, remember, when we talk about you willing something, we are talking about you as a free and rational being consenting to something. That is what we mean by willing something. Now, finally, the idea of it being a universal law of nature. This contends that if it applies to you, who else does it apply to? Everybody categorically, that is in all situations regardless. Cliche, no ifs, and, or buts. If something is truly moral, It is always the case that it's moral. In other words, it's not a situational thing. It does not depend upon the particulars of the circumstances, according to Kant. And that's why we use this word law. If it's a law, it means it always applies, regardless. And for those of you who have been keeping up with the reading, remember that fairness is one of the underlying concerns of Kant. And if something is said to be a law, it would be fair because it applies to all people at all times, regardless of the particular circumstances. So I hope that's fairly clear. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about, actually I do want to talk a little bit more about how this applies. Applying the categorical imperative is actually what leads to hypothetical imperatives. The interpretation of how the categorical imperative applies to specific circumstances. Now, that easy example that I gave you a minute ago, and it's a famous version of one of Kant's categorical imperatives. He contends that no rational being, I'll put this down as an example, no rational being could will what he calls promise breaking. Now, when we talk about promise breaking, we're talking about being untruthful, dishonest, telling a lie. Now, folks, he gets to this rule sort of like this. If I will promise breaking in this particular situation, in any particular situation, I am implicitly saying that anybody should be able to break a promise when they see fit. If I look at any particular situation, I say, in this situation, it is morally permissible to break a promise. A Kantian would say, what you are doing is implicitly contending that any time it suits an individual situation, she ought to break a promise then. Now, take a guess why that is an irrational way of approaching things. I'll cut to the chase. It is because meaningful communication, that is the rationality of communication, depends upon the implicit assumption that when we make statements, that we are doing so truthfully. If you will promise breaking, you're pretty much willing all communication acts to be potentially lies. No rational being would will a world like that. Because instead of mutual trust, we would be fostering mutual distrust and chaos. Now, folks, here's where one of the author's examples comes in. But before I get to that second one, I wanted to talk about how the author explains that Kantian ethics contends that we ought to be acting with integrity. And folks, by integrity, he means that we consistently do our best to follow the moral law. To act with integrity means to act out of consistency with a principle. Now, folks, the kind of integrity that there's a lot of different principles that you could have integrity towards. Many students mix this up. They think that integrity is synonymous with honesty. And this is because that kind of integrity is very often the kind of integrity that is referred to. Now, the author contends that one possible rebuttal that the critic might make is Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Eichmann acted with integrity. They were both Nazis. but they acted with integrity. That is, they were completely duty-bound to doing what was necessary for the good of the cause. In other words, they made the good of their cause the overarching principle that they were dutiful towards. Now, the point that the author is trying to make here is that we should conclude, because of this counterexample, that integrity is not enough. In other words, acting out of integrity is only a moral thing if it's done out of duty to truly moral principles. Now, that truly moral principle that Kant was talking about is the universal law of nature, the categorical imperative. That was the point the author was trying to make with that example. Now, I want to talk about the author's second example. He talks about one of the scenarios from Mark Twain's fictional character, Huckleberry Finn. Now, Huck has run away. And one of the people who he meets with while he's running away is a runaway slave by the name of Jim. Now, Huck made a promise to Jim, a promise that he would help him to get to freedom. Now, Huck was in a moral quandary at one point in the story because he's exploring around and he happens upon some slave bounty hunters. And of course, the slave bounty hunters want to know, who is that over there in the distance? They couldn't see that he was a man of color because it was far enough away. So Huck ends up telling a lie to them about who was over there. Now, Huck is has an internal conflict here because he's done what? He's told a lie, and he's generally been taught that lying is wrong. He's also in a quandary because his society has told him that slavery is the law of the land and breaking the law is bad. He also knows that Jim was property of a woman from the town that he came from, poor Mrs. Watson. He goes, God, my, I feel real bad because Mrs. Watson ain't done me no harm. And here I am telling a lie, keeping her from her property. Now, an author who writes about Huckleberry Finn in connection with an essay on Kantian ethics that the author alludes to, but does not have the collateral reading for in The Ethical Life, is by an author by the name of Jonathan Bennett. I do have it attached to the D2L file in case you're interested in reading it. But what Bennett says is that we applaud Huck's lack of integrity in this case, because we think that Huck did the right thing in this situation by lying to the slave bounty hunters. We think that he did the right thing. Now, I want to go a little bit beyond Bennett here. I actually think that in one sense, Huck certainly did act with Kantian integrity. It's just that in order to act with Kantian integrity, he had, of course, other chips had to fall. Because he had made a what to Jim? He had made a promise to Jim. And not to go a little outside of the Kantian sphere. Because remember, Kant doesn't suggest that we owe any special duties to our friends. We owe duty to the moral law. But he made a promise to a person who became his friend. And to break that promise would have meant to give Jim up to the slave bounty hunters. Now, admittedly, under strict Kantian terms, lying is always wrong. And it's because when you tell a lie, you are treating other people as if they were mere objects. what he calls treating people as means rather than as ends in themselves. So indeed, he disrespected those slave bounty hunters. But most of us would say, what about the slave bounty hunters? And this is not a two wrongs argument here. Most of us would say that they were flagrantly breaking the moral law because they were not only treating other people as mere objects, but they also had the gall to economically profit off of it. Do you get what I'm saying here? Now, part of what I'm doing is also showing the complexity of things. The beauty on the surface of both utilitarianism and Kantianism is they try to reduce morality to one principle, that if we follow it properly, we will know that we have done the right thing. The problem is, what if in this confusing web of things that happen, what if there's more than one issue at play? Because indeed in Huck's case, there was more than one issue at play. Indeed, he had made a promise to Jim. And to break that promise would be to break the moral law. In order to keep this promise to Jim, he had to lie. And the reason I'm going off on this a little bit is because I want to highlight how complex the web of action is sometimes. Is that nice? Now, before I go on to more material, I want to make sure you get this clear. Immanuel Kant frames ethics as a duty. Now, to put this in plain language, a duty isn't necessarily something that you want to do. It is something that you ought to do. Now, there's a good reason why he contends that it's a duty. Because if morality were not a duty and something that you greatly desire to do in an emotional way, take a guess what might be getting in the way of your moral deliberation. Yeah, it's called your self-interest, your emotion. In other words, if you were actually doing something out of passions, it would actually diminish the moral worth of your behavior. To frame morality as a duty, something that you ought to follow not because you passionately want to, but because it is what? But because it is the moral law. In other words, something that you ought to dispassionately follow. That is part of what enables us not only to objectively see right and wrong, but it also enables us to engage in said deliberation and actions without compromising rationality and without getting our emotions involved. This is part of why he frames morality as a duty. Because if you too greatly desire to do it, you may actually be doing it for non-moral reasons. For example, and this is that old example, if I too greatly want to win favor with God so I can get my spot in heaven, perhaps I don't actually deserve moral credit for it. Because if I'm only really in it for the rewards, then that's really no morally better than any kind of rewards that people might behave for, including bank robbing. It just so happens that we tend to give good actions credit, oftentimes regardless of what the motive is. Because we what? Because we condone the outcomes. But for Kant, the outcomes are not what determine moral worth. It's the motive. And there is only one truly moral motive, according to Kant. And that's what he calls the good will. A rational desire to follow the moral law. because it is the moral law. Now, folks, looking ahead, we are going to look a little more deeply into his account. We'll also take a look at one of the major underpinnings of his entire way of thinking. Human beings as intrinsically valuable, centers of worth, and how that plays into his analysis. Page 2. Now, this chapter, the author simply titled Autonomy and Respect. We have already implicitly talked about these concepts already, but here is where the author talks about it more in depth. Now, we've already talked about the hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative. I will not recap that right now, although there's a good chance we'll talk about it more down the line. Now, before we start going down to my other bullet points, what does it mean to act with autonomy? And if there's any takers who feel confident and loud, don't hesitate. To act with autonomy means to actually behave as an unencumbered individual. An autonomous individual's hand is not being coerced. Hand is not being forced. Now, what are some things that might count as hindrances to autonomy? Any examples? What kind of things might hinder my ability to act with autonomy? I'll go for the easy one. The cheap and easy one is fear. If I am doing something consistent with the moral law, simply because I'm afraid of being punished, then I technically don't deserve a gold star from following the moral law, even if I acted in conformity with what the moral law would command. Why? Because my motive isn't truly a moral motive. Egoism and any factors related to egoism can get in the way of a person's autonomy. Because if you are motivated by egoistic drives, then in a sense, your internal puppet strings are being pulled. The author of the text never directly drops this word, but it's implicit. Many human beings believe in free will. Now, granted, the more we have learned about neurophysiology, the more an absolute belief in free will has come into question among some of us. Because we start to recognize that there are things going on in our brains that oftentimes have a huge influence on the things that we do, like and dislike, etc., etc. That me as a so-called individual really doesn't have control over. Well, why? Because things like biological determinism. On top of that, things like psychological conditioning devices. If you happen to be an industrious person, it may have little whatsoever to do with your having been an autonomous actor who has decided to be industrious. I was conditioned into being industrious from the time that I was 5 years old. I was taught that it was sinful to behave that way. Idle hands, are the devil's workshop. Yeah, that was the cliche, idle hands. In other words, I was religiously motivated into being industrious because I thought God would be giving me gold stars and I would be rewarded in heaven, even though I wasn't going to be rewarded on earth, most likely. Right? hard work oftentimes doesn't pay. Most of you are probably well aware of that, right? Anyway, I won't get my politics going there. I'll behave myself a tiny little bit. But yeah, there have been various challenges to whether or not human beings are actually autonomous. According to Kant, in order for moral worth to be possible, genuine autonomy must at least sometimes be possible. Because otherwise, the agent really wouldn't deserve credit. Now, desserts kept coming up in this chapter, I hope you noticed. Now, I may as well talk about this now. The principle of respect. According to Kant, we have a duty to respect certain kinds of beings. And by the way, I'm specifically talking about those individuals that have the capacity for what we previously called moral agency. Remember, what gives us the possibility of being moral agents? The fact that we are, by nature, rational beings, and also because we at least sometimes have the capacity for autonomy. In other words, we are not just automata. We are not just blind robots carrying out a program, according to Kant. This is why, according to Kant, all human beings are deserving of respect. Or to put this in other language, human beings possess intrinsic or inherent worth because they are the kinds of beings that they are. Now, something that's important to mention, because the text doesn't really do this part justice. And I'm not faulting the textbook here, because when you're doing a survey textbook, you can really only do so much to keep things manageable. But I happen to think that this is fairly important. And the author technically does talk about it later on when he talks about this. When the author talks about this thing called the principle of humanity. The principle of humanity is oftentimes connected with what is sometimes called Kant's second formulation of guess what? Second formulation of the categorical imperative. I'm just abbreviating it here on the board. Now, the second formulation of the categorical imperative, and this will sound fancy, Dan, I admit, reads something like this. Always act as if rational beings are never treated as mere means, but as ends in themselves. Never treat your fellow rational beings as mere means, but always treat them as ends in themselves. Now let me put that into plain English. Human beings are not objects. You ought never to treat them as merely objects. Human beings are what we call subjects. Because human beings are subjects, and because they possess the capacity for autonomy, because they are rational beings, and thus the capacity for agency, every single human being possesses what Kant would call inherent worth. So to treat a fellow human being as if she were a mere object is to transgress the moral law. Treat human beings as if they had value just like what? Just like you do. You ought never to treat human beings as mere objects. Treat them as beings that have the same value as any other rational beings do. Now, the author of, I want to reiterate this, although I've already talked about it before. I just wanted to reiterate what the goodwill was. Kant contends that the only thing that is valuable in and of itself is a goodwill. Now, what he calls the goodwill is not a passionate fellow feeling or emotional concern for other people. The goodwill refers to the rational desire to obey the moral law. That is what a goodwill is. So to behave morally in this sense, it means to have this passionless, rational desire to obey the moral law, according to Kant. Now, folks, some of you may already find this to be a little bit problematic, because some of you might think it is impossible to divorce our conduct from emotions. Some of you might go a step further and say, I think that it is troubling if somebody divorces their emotions from it. Just to be absolutely blunt about this, I think that if the likes of Himmler and Eichmann had really meaningfully thought about the fact that the final solution involved the extermination of human beings, not mere numbers. Because remember, whenever we're able to harm human beings, we almost always in our minds have to dehumanize them one way or another. Because it's actually quite difficult to train human beings to kill people that they actually deem as human beings. This is why one of the strategies during wartime is to make sure that those who are going to have to kill have already dehumanized the enemy in their own minds. And keep in mind, that involves a kind of dispassionate action. This is why some people think having a little bit of emotion might actually be important for the legitimate possibility of morality. Because once you start turning everything into, once everything becomes an abstraction, sure, being able to think abstractly does give us the possibility to do what Kant was talking about. But turning human beings into abstractions could be equally used to dehumanize and to have completely different results. Does that make pretty good sense, I hope? This is a concern that some people have with Kant's ethics, that the author of the text didn't really broach. Yeah, because indeed it asks us to think abstractly. Abstract thought can oftentimes lead to very difficult things, or bad things, once you turn humans into abstractions. Now, I already talked about the principle of humanity. Now, the author talks about what he calls 5 problems with the principle of humanity. And in discussing these, we will be able to flesh out some other issues here. Now, first, the author contends that treating others as an end is vague. I don't think Kant would say this. I think Kant would say, if you understand what it means to treat another person as an end, that is a center of value, it means that you ought never to treat them as if they were merely an object. Even if it's not easy to define exactly what this means all of the time, doesn't mean it's a bad principle. But yeah, indeed, it's not always easily spelled out what it would mean to treat individuals as ends in themselves, as opposed to mere means. But I don't know that this necessarily attacks the principle. Number two, the author contends that the principle of humanity might give unclear advice about what people deserve. Now recall that utilitarians were concerned not with giving people what they deserved. They were concerned with what will produce the optimum outcomes. Kant's ethics is not concerned with optimum outcomes. As a matter of fact, if you're thinking about optimistic results, you might be actually behaving selfishly according to Kant, because you will get your desire for good outcomes involved. Now, this is the point at which the author drops this phrase. Oops. Please don't forget this. Kant was a firm supporter of the principle of lex talionis. That is Latin for the law, lex. Talionis, talons. The law of the claw is what it literally translates to. In common everyday verbiage, we call the law of the claw what? Yeah, that old eye for an eye principle. Now, Kant believed that we should always give people what they deserve. And admittedly, in many situations, it's difficult to tell what giving people what they deserve is. However, Kant does write, and by the way, he does not clearly explain this because we didn't have those designations then. When Kant is talking about the morality of capital punishment, he is specifically talking about instances of murder one. He is not talking about accidental homicides and things of this nature. Now, folks, I want to give you his argument for lex talionis because I want to make sure you don't screw it up later on. But number two, I also want to explain for you why most of the people who you know who are pro-capital punishment are not in it for moral reasons, as Kant is. Now, Kant contends that if indeed the perpetrator was behaving out of autonomy, that is, if he freely chose to commit this act of murder one, then he should understand that he has treated another human being in the most egregious way possible. I mean, that is treating people as means to an end, to the maximum. If you take away, and I'll use modern day language, if you have taken away somebody's right to life, then the only fair way to repay that person in that situation is by taking away that which is most precious to that person. And that's to take away that person's life. That is why Kant argues for lex talionis in the case of instances of murder one. He contends that it is the only thing that is absolutely fair. And please don't get this wrong either. He is not doing it for the sake of the victims. Lex talionis is the moral principle because it will actually respect the dignity of the perpetrator. Because to do any less to the perpetrator would say that he was not fully a human being. To put him to death for having murdered another human being actually respects the dignity of the murderer. To do any less would say, oh, he wasn't in control of himself. We'll take it easy on him. So yeah, it's out of respect for the dignity of the perp. Now, folks, I happen to think that the average person who is pro-capital punishment is certainly not in it for Kantian reasons. And I think Kant would be well aware of this too. Because the average pro-capital punishment person, you start talking to them, they'll first mention justice, but very quickly they will it will turn into revenge. And by the way, if you get too seething about it, if you get too excited about the prospect of executing someone, that is, if you get an emotional good feeling out of getting even, then your motive is not moral. Because justice is supposed to be what? Dispassionate. In other words, I couldn't wait to be the one to pull the button. Well, you're just as bad as the murderer, most likely. Because the desire for revenge is not the desire for justice. And by the way, the biblical principle wasn't aimed at revenge either. It was aimed at sort of curtailing what could be done. Because back in those times, law and order typically meant people taking the law into their own hands. If somebody wronged your family, you would wrong them back, but worse. And then guess what they would do? Wrong you back, but even worse. And pretty soon, a blood feud would result. An eye for an eye basically said, if he steals something from you, you can what? Yeah, you can exact your pound of flesh, but no more. In other words, what it was designed to do was to set the limits on what could be done. And it was designed also not to get the spirit of revenge, in us all fired up. It was actually designed to calm us down and to keep a level head about these things. That's why most of my extended family members who just love the death penalty, they're not in it for Kantian reasons. They're also not in it for good Christian reasons either. Because, they can't wait for the blood. Yeah. They love the idea of it, which means they're vengeful people, is what they are. And they like to see people who they don't like harmed. That is actually bringing about basically the worst in us. Our hateful, violent passions. Kant was very much against this. Now, I've already talked about this, so I won't get into this anymore. I already discussed the idea that there is some challenge to whether or not we are actually autonomous beings. But Immanuel Kant says that we are, at least sometimes. And it's because we have the capacity to reason that we can think about ourselves in the abstract. And we can say, what should a rational being do? Not what should I do, but what should a rational being do? And if you can step back from, the emotion of the situation, Kant believes that we can at least sometimes be autonomous. Moral luck. This idea of moral luck gets at the idea that indeed a person who might have moral motives might end up having things not go down very well. We might misunderstand that person's motives because we can't do what? We can't read minds, folks. Now, the scenario the author gave was the virtuous mother who might, in a moment of difficulty, end up shaking her baby. Under normal circumstances, the shaking of a baby would be just one little event among many. But in some cases, what happens? The shaken baby has severe damage for one reason or another. Just one time, one mistake where the person really wasn't, focusing upon the moral law at that point. And wasn't really meaning any harm either. But nonetheless, if something very bad happens, we might end up judging that person very harshly. And by the way, in some cases, we might sometimes give someone credit where they don't deserve it. That is because we can't get inside of their head and things just happen to turn out consistent with morality. Hope that makes good sense. Now, finally, it fails to explain why those who lack rationality and autonomy also deserve respect. This is where the author of our text was talking about, again, what we call marginal cases. If you plan to write a paper arguing for animal rights, Kant would not be your man. Because remember, in order to actually deserve to be treated with dignity, only rational beings who have the capacity for autonomy are actually deserving, according to Kant. Now notice what kind of human beings this would also provide a difficulty for. The differently abled, the mentally challenged. Because the mentally challenged don't have the capacity to be moral agents in a Kantian sense. So in order to overcome this difficulty, the Kantian would have to say, well, even though those individuals do not possess rationality, they would possess rationality if there were issues with their chromosomes. Therefore, we still ought to treat them with respect anyway. Even though the critic would say, from a strict Kantian standpoint, there is no intrinsic value to the mentally challenged, from a strict Kantian viewpoint. So in other words, the Kantian would have to do some explanatory gymnastics here that the critic wouldn't necessarily accept. Because if you make the claim, only rational beings are deserving of respect, then going back on that would seem problematic. Have a good one.